Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. This amazing conversation with Gill from Australia comes to you in the form of a double episode. Fish, as he refers to himself, has so much wisdom to share. I already knew from before we started recording that it would not fit into the usual 45 minutes of this podcast. I knew Fish from Instagram, where I became intrigued with his approach of conscious communication. Listening to some of the podcasts where he had been a guest, I've been so drawn to what he shared in his capacity as a coach and through his unique approach. In episode 51 and 52, he takes us through how he dealt with his own grief, using the approach of conscious communication with himself. First, he honestly acknowledged and validated all his thoughts, then felt into the actual emotional experience. From there, he entered the field of his yearning and the longing in his heart, which he recognized and honored, even when it, in the case of his loss, could not be met. Bringing loving awareness to the whole experience without wanting to change it makes every component of the experience matter. Fish says we are not usually bringing loving awareness, but we are trained to respond to pain by usually either dismissing, minimizing, comparing, assigning fault, understanding, or fixing it, when what it actually needs is to be validated. Okay, I won't say more, but I can promise you with certainty that if you listen to one episode, you would want to listen to the other. I recommend you start by the first episode, number 51. About this week's guest. Gill, aka Fish, is a heart coach, yoga teacher and transformational facilitator based in Australia and working internationally. He is committed to the global spread of conscious communication practices that enable all beings to experience love in every moment, which appears to have gone missing. Make sure to check out Fish's links, his website, and most importantly, his Instagram, and enjoy today's episode. So welcome, Fish. It's so great to have you have time with me here on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a delight. Thanks for having me.
How are you today?
I'm feeling like super inspired. I've just spent an hour and a half with a couple who've been working with me for quite some time, and hearing the shifts in their relationship have been really beautiful. So I'm feeling very uplifted, and I'm excited to chat because I think this topic of how to move through the inevitable loss of life is it's an absolutely critical thing for us to discuss. Something we can be so alone with often. And so it's lovely to be together with you and with your listeners to just bring more light to what feels dark at times.
Yeah. And so I want to say that here because today is the birthday of my girls, and the people who've listened to this podcast know that I had twins and the younger one passed away, and to be in connection with you all over in Australia is really good in this moment. So I like that. It's a happy day for me. It's not about the death, it's about their birth for me right now. And so I'm glad that this is the auspicious day of the birthday of my girls. But why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about how your life has been touched by grief, loss, trauma?
Great. So interestingly, it was my dad's birthday yesterday, and so he passed away about 9 years ago, and a few months later, my stepfather. So the two men in my life died within 3 months of each other. both to cancer, and I've actually, me and my ex-wife and my children have experienced a great deal of loss through cancer and suicide. But interestingly, when I was reflecting before our conversation today, I was thinking that those deaths have not been nearly as impactful on my heart as have some of the relationship breakdowns that have happened in my life. And so I think really there's been a couple of moments where I felt so broken that I found it difficult to consider continuing. One was after 15 years of relationship with my ex-wife, leaving that relationship for my own well-being, choosing my own happiness in a situation that felt fraught and unable to change. I hadn't counted on the extent to which I would be immersed in the grief of the loss of the family relationships. Yeah. Like we're 12 years down the track now, and my relationship with her is wonderful. And my relationship with one of my kids is super close. But shortly after separating, I was plunged into deep depression, and it was a very, very dark time for me. So that was one of the moments of the deepest grief experience in my life. And the other was 4 years ago now, I was in the start of a new relationship, romantic relationship, and I felt very much in love, and we were planning a life together. And then one thing led to another, and her ex-partner found out about our relationship. And when my partner at the time drew a clear boundary with him about not being okay with him being in contact with her anymore, he took his life. And that was a profound moment of grief for me, because here's the woman I love plunged into her own darkness, and we flew back to Australia. She flew back to the East Coast. I flew back to the West Coast, and we were going to continue our journeys together. And then COVID hit, and we were geographically separated because there was a closure of the borders between East and Western Australia. So I found myself in this position where I was very certain about my love for her. And for her, it seemed to her as if she'd killed him by choosing me. And so the grief was so multi-layered for me, because I felt such anger. I felt such hurt. And I just, for 7 or 8 months, long distance, I tried to love her better. I tried to love her back into remembering our union. And in the end, she turned towards someone else. And that feeling of stuckness, and like I remember mornings I would wake up and I would hate the universe. Like I'd be so down on life, that life could serve me up something that's felt so unfair, that I couldn't love her back into my life, that I couldn't fix it, I couldn't change it, I couldn't feel loved by her again, because she was just kind of gone into her own grief process. And it was profoundly, profoundly upsetting. And I've still got journals of just pouring my soul onto the page. And, that really has deeply informed my understanding of my own grieving process and how I support others. Not just moving through grief, but actually tending to any emotional experience. And we can get into it, but one of the things that I've seen most clearly in the work that I get to do with humans and in my own grieving process is that we find it very difficult to really, really tune in to our authentic emotional experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that sounds a bit crazy because it's alive within us in any moment. But to actually tune in and be able to recognize and articulate and validate the emotional experience we're having is something that, one, the mind is no good at. The heart is great at it, but the mind is no good at it. And we live in a society that tends to prioritize the mind. Two, we get so lost in our analysis of the situation, which is deeply compelling. I spent so much time in that separation thinking, why is this happening? Why couldn't he this? Why can't she see this? Like, in so much mental resistance all the time, not even tuning in to the very real experience I was having. Instead, just making love to this external analysis of what it meant about me, what it meant about her, what it meant about him, what it meant about the future, what it meant about the past.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the clearest lessons that my grieving process has given me is it has illuminated the extent to which human beings tend not to be masterful at recognizing, articulating, and bringing loving awareness to our very real emotional experience in any moment, but particularly in moments where that emotional experience feels overwhelming.
Yeah. So you mentioned two things that a lot of people can relate to when I heard you say that is already. One is life is being unfair by handing me this loss, and that this person is no longer with me or is not going to live in a case of death to wherever they are supposed to. And the other thing is about ruminations, which are very common in early grief. Because the mind is trying to figure this out, is trying to figure out the fact that reality, as I wish it should be or could be or wanted to be, is not as reality presents itself every day. And the brain is trying to every day say, well, but this is how way I want it or how it should be, and it's not. So tell us a little bit more about how it has informed you to tend and to help other people tend, or how did you do it, tend to your really this emotional experience and acknowledge, because really it's hard. Grief is intense, and most people, when they have their first very significant loss, they come to a place of emotional intensity that they have not before met. And that is scary and overwhelming, as you just said.
Yeah. And I think whenever we experience extreme emotions, we tend to want to pull away from them because most of us haven't ever been trained in or had it modeled for us of staying present and grounded and open in the face of overwhelming emotional sensation. We live in a culture that sells us things to distract us from feeling.
Yeah.
So if we've never really had anyone say it's okay to feel deeply, then we're probably going to be obsessed with trying to stop the feelings.
Yeah.
Like trying to get out of the feelings, because very naturally, this is pain we never wanted. As you've so beautifully spoken to, the reality that we had in mind had joy in it, not loss in it, not grief in it. So, we are faced with the experiences of emotions that we never wanted. And we didn't choose. And we don't even see that we might have actually even contributed to. We just feel like this emotional experience of pain and loss and grief and darkness and weightiness. I loved finding out that the word grief comes from the word gravitas, meaning like weightiness, like the burden. So we're busy trying to get out of feelings that we feel uncomfortable having. So that's one thing. And so I think just starting off with recognizing, I'm overwhelmed with a bunch of emotions that I would really rather not have. I think that's a good place to start, because at least we're acknowledging, one, that we've got some emotions, and two, that we're probably likely to busy ourselves with trying to get rid of them. But as you know, emotions don't shift when we try and get rid of them.
You basically just described my job when I work with clients in early raw grief. And this is what I'm doing. I say, what you're feeling is normal, but normal doesn't help because they don't like it. It's normal given the circumstances, and it's to be expected. However, how do we be with it, not deal with it in terms of the name of the podcast, but how are we being with it? How did you, first of all, do that in yourself? How did you deal with those strong emotions when you had them? And what do you do with clients when they have them?
Yeah. So I talked to you a little bit about how the analysis that came up in my mind. I was for quite a few months. I found myself just obsessed, just running these stories about what that must mean about him, what it must mean about her. You know, she'd actually taken all the images of us off social media and put images of him and her back on. So there was the experience of feeling completely deleted. And my mental obsession became, trying to kind of like get lost in the analysis of that. Why would someone do that? How unfair that is. She should this, she shouldn't this. I don't deserve this. I should this. I deserve this. So just really get caught up in the analysis. So one of the things I started to do, because we can't just shut analysis off, because we're all born with a mind, right? And the mind is a this or that machine. The mind's job is to analyze, right? So rather than resist it, I actually put it on the page. So I would give myself like the left-hand page to write all my analyses down, and I would let it rip. You know, there's a tendency when we get clued into analysis, it's a bit confronting. When we really listen to what the mind actually says, it can be like, I would never tell anyone the sorts of things I was thinking. But the freedom that came from me actually putting on the page all the vindictive, vicious, nasty, judgmental, critical thoughts that I was having about me, her, him, others, like really let it rip. And there was something soothing about actually just opening that channel and letting, because as you said, the mind's analysis is really just a striving for mental safety in the face of great unsafety or uncertainty. So I let it rip. And then on the opposite page, I would start to translate my analysis into experience. So if on the left-hand page I might have said, I don't effing deserve to have my photos deleted. How dare, she couldn't really have loved me if she was willing to do that, blah, 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 on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, I would think to myself, what's the experience I'm actually trying to speak to there? I feel undervalued. I feel hurt. I feel deleted, like I feel like I don't matter anymore to her. I feel unloved, unprioritized, uncared about. And so on the right-hand side, I would really just go to town on writing down the feelings that I had alive in me. And what was very surprising for me there was actually that grief, for me, grief comprised 50 different emotions.
So a technical question here, because I'm guessing that when you let it rip, it's not really the same time that you then can write what is the experience. There was probably a time difference, right? First you let it rip.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes at the same time?
Sometimes, some days I would just let the analysis, like all the vitriolic thoughts, all the me and them, us and you, black and white, should, shouldn't, all that, which I now call conflict mind, which is always the conflict mind. The way in which we create a victim-villain story out of everything is really just a protective mechanism. It's the way we try and reassure ourselves of safety or certainty. So some days I would just do that, And then the next day or 2 days later or 3 days later, I might come back and feel into what's the emotions? What are the emotions that I'm actually trying to express through that analysis? Because if you consider that there's an emotional experience in us at all times, and then arising from that emotional experience is our interpretation of the world around us.
Yeah.
So I did the translation back the other way and just said, if that analysis is alive in me, what emotions must I be feeling? If I'm saying such vitriolic things, then there's quite likely some anger and some hurt and some sorrow being protected by anger. So I started to learn to validate my own emotions, and I actually recognized that although I would have always considered myself to be quite emotionally intelligent, it turns out that I really found it quite difficult to articulate all the aspects of the emotional experience that I was having. So I was practicing writing down, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm hurt, I'm embarrassed, I'm isolated, I'm alone, I'm ashamed, I feel guilty, I feel justified, I feel vengeful, like really letting it rip. And the beautiful thing about that was I came to realize, and this is the foundation of a lot of the work that I do with my clients to start with in conscious communication, is I started to realize that naturally as human beings, we put our experience into two piles. We have the pile that I'm okay to recognize that I'm feeling, and then the pile that I'm really not okay to recognize that I'm feeling. And in yogic terms, in yogic philosophy, we call that raga and dvesha, which is our attachments and our aversions. We have preferences about what we feel and aversions to other things. For example, very commonly, not always, but very commonly when I work with a woman, she'll be much more okay with expressing sorrow and fear than she will be expressing anger. Why? Because culturally she might have been conditioned to believe that an angry woman would be dismissed as
crazy,
being ridiculous, crazy, hysterical, right? So then she doesn't want to be seen as an angry woman because that would leave her, in the eyes of others, feeling invalidated. So she turns away from very real anger that she's got. I mean, when you think about it, like it just blows my mind when you think about it. Think of the millions and millions of reasons that every single woman on the planet would have to feel deeply angry. Like it's compelling, right? And yet, most of the women I've ever worked with find it very difficult to feel okay to say, yes, part of my emotional experience is anger or rage or hatred. And typically when I work with men, not always, but typically, men will be much more okay with validating the experience in them of frustration, of anger, of disappointment, of irritability. And when I ask him, do you also feel sad? He tends to be like, don't think so. When I say, do you feel fearful? Do you feel confused or uncertain? He's like, not really. I don't really know. I think I just feel shitty. I think I just feel irritable. So, we tend to be conditioned as to what the okay pile consists of and what the not okay pile consists of. And as long as we're breaking it into two piles, we're turning away from our experience.
Yeah. And I think you just made an interesting point as well. If I think about a couple grieving their child, it makes a lot of sense. Certain things that are confusing because the other person feels or expresses it in so different ways. We know about the different ways of expressing grief. In traditional sense, there's the emotional way and the cognitive way, but let's not get too technical about that. But it's like a confusion about one person. Well, you're expressing it like that, but I do it this way. And the other person says, well, I experience it this way. But they're losses about the same person in the same moment.
Yes. So isn't that interesting? We think we have to sort of have similar experiences in order to understand each other.
Mm.
It's like we think we have to agree on what it's like for us. But essentially, every human being has a very different experience of every moment.
Yeah.
Like we have to. I've got my 5 senses functioning and my mind creating meaning out of the 5 senses. All my sensory data and your sensory data are different, right? In every moment, actually.
Mm.
Now, there might be great similarities, but there will always be distinctions. So I think, being able to, if we're talking about a grieving couple, being able to recognize that my experience and your experience of that very same situation will be radically different, just as they are similar, and making space for the differences. And also, it's very common in a situation of great upset that impacts a couple, any upset that impacts a couple, there may well be feelings of resentment and hurt towards each other, even about an external loss.
Mm-hmm.
A feeling of like resentment because I think you should have done more, or you never really understood me back then when we were sort of fighting for this. And I think we can tend to turn away from those difficult emotions in order to avoid potentially upsetting conversations. But if we're turning away from any of our emotional experience, we're going to stay stuck in it.
Mm.
So I think being able to, one of the pieces of work that I do with every client is choose a moment of upset and spend some time recognizing and articulating and validating all the components of your pain, all of them, and keep letting your awareness expand into corners of your emotional experience that you have kept hidden from yourself. Prompts like, are you angry? Are you full of hatred? Are you resentful? Are you ashamed? Are you feeling justified? Have you got deep sorrow? Is there a sense of fear or doubt or confusion? Like keep expanding the container so that we get to fit it all in. Have you read the Rumi poem, The Guest House?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He talks about like welcoming all the visitors in. If the visitors are distressing emotions, welcome them all in. Let them clean out your house. Welcome them in. And that's not naturally what we do. One demonstration of the fact that I was in resistance to part of my emotional experience is I got 2 years down the track and entered another very beautiful relationship. And there was a point in that relationship where one day I woke up and I was just struck by grief again about that situation of the past loss. And I remember sitting on my couch and thinking I shouldn't still be feeling sad. This is a way in which I've already turned away. So I've got sadness, and on top of the sadness, I've already put a lid on it saying I shouldn't be feeling this way.
Mm-hmm.
And, many people might start to resonate with that idea that we've already predetermined what we're okay with feeling and not okay with feeling.
Yeah.
As long as we're making a yes pile and a no pile, the no pile goes unrecognized and sits there. And it doesn't dissolve by us turning away from it. It sits there and sits there in our library of grief, and it doesn't go anywhere until we can wrap it in loving awareness. I
would think that from the way you described before how you work with clients, it's very difficult to go to that no pile. When I think about myself, I often just feel confused. But there's many other things that I potentially don't even have access to because it's maybe in the no pile, or maybe I don't know that I have this. So how do clients then get access to, or people that are grieving get access to the things, the full experience?
Yeah. Well, to start with, I think, when I work with clients, I will prompt them into the corners. Because from my perspective, when I listen to their experience, when I listen to what's happened, I immediately am flooded with what I imagine my emotions to be, and I just let that guide me. So I can say to them,
resonance,
yeah, it makes sense that you were confused and hurt. Were you also kind of enraged? And they might say, oh, I'm not sure about enraged. And I'll say to them, that's okay. You may not have been. However, it would make sense if you had been. So all I'm doing there is giving permission.
I love, because
was there also anger? Was there also doubt? Was there also sorrow? And after a time, they get that I'm actually just giving them permission to look.
Yeah. I was laughing before because there's one person that comes into my mind that would say something, and I said, well, are you angry? No, I'm not angry. So, things like that. Maybe also from a developmental point of view, quite a place of safety to not feel certain things, because it was
not okay.
It was not okay, and it was not safe to be feeling or expressing certain emotion in the family of origin. So therefore, those had to become coveted or buried or suppressed in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's parts of our, we all have an identity that we're wanting to create and maintain all the time. And, I was working with a client maybe 6 months ago, and she was talking about the upset that she had around her sister-in-law not reaching out to her at a time of great loss. She'd lost her mother fairly recently, and she was like, my sister-in-law hasn't reached out once. And I said, how is that for you? And she said, this is very typical of, not being able to feel into our emotions and still preferring our analysis. She said to me, well, it's no big deal, but what a cow. Like, what a selfish person. Why she should have been reaching out to me if she really cared. Like, why can't she be sensitive enough? So notice how she's diverted from the emotional experience and gone straight into her analysis of someone else.
Yeah.
And so I just stayed with that for a little while, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. It makes sense to me that you've been thinking that way about your sister. And what does that analysis point to? Do you feel hurt? And she was like, I don't feel hurt. And I was like, okay, cool. But it's okay if you do. Like, I'm imagining if I was you, I might have felt hurt. And she was like, no, I don't think I'm feeling hurt. It's just what an insensitive sister-in-law. So she kept going back to that. And eventually, it took, 45 minutes or so before she was like, you know what? I felt hurt.
She was convinced.
Yeah. And I said to her, what was difficult about that for you? And she said, I don't like to think of myself as someone who might feel so easily hurt.
Yeah.
So there's the way that our identity, trying to keep our identity together, trying to appear to the world a certain way, will actually mean that we turn away from certain aspects of our emotional experience. If I don't want to appear jealous to someone, to the world, then I'm likely not to acknowledge jealousy. If I grew up thinking angry men were bad men, then it's quite likely that I turn away from the very inevitable anger that I might feel sometimes. If I've been told that I'm kind of weak person if I'm sad, then I'll tend to go, I'm not sad. I'm not weak. I don't feel weak emotions. I'm a masculine man. So yeah, so the first thing is giving people permission for them to authentically inquire into all the components of their emotional experience. And I will ask, what else, what else, what else, what else, what else? And I will continue to ask that, because actually we find in reality, our emotional experience it's not just sad and angry. It's sad, angry, hurt, ashamed, confused, alone, fearful. Like it's often a cocktail of 10, 15, 20 emotions, actually, if we're really open and honest about ourselves. So that's the first of two components of our experience, is recognizing all the aspects of pain, all the different emotions that I might consider to be the experience of pain, grief, all the components, allowing space for all of them. The second component of our experience that I discovered it was incredibly useful to bring awareness to was our yearning. What my tender heart has been longing for and continues to long for. And that was an amazing thing to open my eyes to, because part of what my heart needed in order to feel soothed was for my longing to be recognized, even as it went unmet. So I started to get, part of the translation I did from my analysis back into experience not only was pain, but it was also what's my heart yearning for? Behind the analysis that says, she should have this, or she shouldn't have this, or how dare she this, or why couldn't she this, or etc. All the analysis. Behind all of that was a bunch of longing in my heart. And so I started to get really clear about what that longing was, because I wanted to honor it. And so I would come up with, on the right-hand side of the page, I would write things down like, I want my love to be enough for us. I want the power of me loving to bring her back to me. I wanted to share a life together. I longed to feel her touch. I longed for him to get support so this didn't impact us. And that became important for me to feel into the yearning in my heart, because there was a point where she met another person and fell in love and rang me and said, "We're done." At that point, I really turned on myself and I said, what kind of idiot? This is my conversation with myself. I was like, what kind of idiot would stay loving her for 7 months across the continent while she hadn't said I love you once in that time, not since that phone call where she found out that he died. So I really turned on myself. And the healing step I took was to actually recognize what was the beautiful yearning in my heart behind staying for so long. It was actually wonderful. It was hoping that love would be enough. It was demonstrating my commitment to the relationship. It was wanting to honor her. It was longing to support her. It was wanting to feel connection again. Like, the deeper I reached into the longing of my tender heart, the yearning of my tender heart, the more beauty I found there. Mm. And there was something that might sound a bit counterintuitive, because it sounds like we're focusing on that which can't be. But there was something deeply, deeply soothing to my heart. It brought me a lot of tears, like it really brought grief to the surface. But recognizing and starting to honor my yearning and how beautiful it was, even if the actions I'd taken based on that yearning brought me pain. So, we flew back to Australia in March, and it was, I think, the start of October when she rang me and said, I'm not going to come and see you. Actually, I've fallen in love. And so that March to October period, it brought me great pain to stay in contact with her and stay devoted to her. And that was an expression of a very beautiful series of longings in my heart. Am I making sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So bringing awareness to what my beautiful heart yearns for, even behind the things I've done that have actually brought myself pain, including ways I might medicate myself, ways I might distract myself. Like, all that behavior is based on a beautiful longing to feel less pain, to have my pain recognized, to have her in less pain. And so I got quite masterful at recognizing the yearning behind what I'd done, as well as the pain in the situation. And so then I had two components: what my heart was longing for and what my heart was suffering with. And suddenly those two components started to feel like the whole of my heart. like the complete set of my heart, what it wanted more of and what it wanted less of. And then I started to think, okay, well, how do I bring loving awareness to that? Because it turns out that when we identify our experience, we don't naturally bring loving awareness to it. So I've started to think of loving awareness as, like that image of the kind, benevolent grandmother or grandfather. Some of us never had that person, right? So maybe some of us have never had any person in our life like this, but picture the person who can come to you in an hour of need and they can just wrap you in their arms and they can rub your back and they're not fixing it. They're not doing anything about it. They're just right here and they're just like, yes, yes, yes. And so there's this safe container for you to actually just be in your experience, and it gets fully recognized. And you have this sense that like every part of my component matters. So every component of my experience matters, and it's all just being held and loved.
So this has been episode 1 of this double episode. Make sure to check in next week for the continuation conversation with Fish. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.